I'm going to talk specifically about some repairs and maintenance issues as they relate to historic homes. The first place to start, and when we look at the treatment of heritage, is with the Ecommerce New Zealand Charter, and it is really the guiding document of principles around how we deal with heritage. Ecommerce New Zealand links to the wider Ecommerce worldwide organization, and a lot of countries have their own charters that are specific to each of their environments. So New Zealand has its own charter, which recognizes that we have a particular history and collection of heritage, and that the principles are tailored to that particular to those particular conditions, including having Indigenous cultural heritage that we need to be responsible for. So the repairs, maintenance and repairs comes under the heading of preservation. There are a number of ways in which we conserve heritage. There's preservation, there's reconstruction, restoration, adaptation. They're all ways in which we conserve heritage. You know, and adaptation being the most invasive, but we have to accept that places, as places evolve and change, they need to respond to people's needs, and sometimes they can't keep their original use, and so we have to be able to adapt them. But at the end, when we're talking about preservation, we're trying not to do very much. We're trying not to make a lot of intervention into a place so that it can retain its original fabric, its original character and features, and we try at that level to ensure the longevity of places. So maintenance and repair under preservation, and if we look at the definitions in the Ecommerce New Zealand Charter, we see that maintenance means the regular and ongoing protective care of a place to prevent deterioration and retain its cultural heritage value. Repairs means to make good decayed and damaged fabric using identical, closely similar, or otherwise appropriate material. So we're trying, at a very basic level, to try and counteract the effects of entropy and ensure that places can retain their heritage fabric and features as much as possible. One of the most William Morris was a very important character. One will knows him probably for the design of many wallpapers and fabrics that are still produced. But in his time, he was very important in recognizing, I think, with the rampant production of cheap products as a result of the Industrial Revolution, he was reacting to the fact that so much of the tradition of the craftsman and he harked back to kind of medieval times when there was quality and craft, and felt that we were losing a lot of that with a lot of the manufactured goods and furniture that were being produced at the time. And so his philosophy was to try and think about creating honest and simple and utilitarian and goods that were of quality and had the hand of the craftsman in them. He also saw that what was happening with a lot of our heritage was that it was being reinvented. There was a lot of rebuilding of places. He said, let's stop. We've got to have more respect for the genuine and authentic materials and features that places from our past inherently have. And so he set up the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings. This was in 1877, and one of its most important tenets was that you needed to just continue to maintain and repair places, and that was the most important thing that you did at a very fundamental level. So he used to talk about staving off decay by daily care, and that such action will not only restrain or even obviate the need for repairs later, it will prevent the loss of original fabric and is cost effective. So, you know, those things make absolute sense. You know, you take care of something, then, you know, you save yourself money in the long run because you're not having to replace it. You're doing repairs where necessary, and you're keeping the original fabric. So he was really important. The Society SPAB, as it's called, still exists, and every year they have a number of scholars who learn a lot of the precepts around how to restore and take care of buildings. But he was a really important person for recognizing that as part of a conservation process, repairs and maintenance were really key. So one of the first important things, I'll just talk about maintenance to start with. One of the really important things is to do routine inspections. And I know the temptation often with any place is to wait until something happens and then you have to repair it. But if you can be proactive and look, it doesn't have to be, you know, really detailed document, although we do want detailed maintenance, routine maintenance documents for really significant places. But just having a plan, having a regular plan around looking at a place and having a regime for regularly checking the condition of the buildings, looking at the grounds and the structures for their material integrity and soundness is a really valuable way to just keep a kind of health check on a heritage building, to see to ensure its integrity and its weatherproofness. You can see here with the before conservation work on Hume Court, there was obviously a lot of up in the kind of interior valley. Nobody had been up there for a very long time looking at all the broken slates and, you know, wondering why it is that in a rainstorm there was water getting into the building. It was clear that there was a lot of maintenance that needed to happen to the roof and flashings that weren't effective and that sort of thing. So routine inspections would involve looking at the roof cladding, you know, checking if it's a sheet roof that it's flat, that you don't have any slippage. If you've got tile cladding, that there aren't displaced or missing elements, or failed or missing fixings. Check flashings around chimneys, flashings in valleys to make sure that those are in good condition. Checking gutters and downpipes. You need to check that the connections are effective. You know, sometimes you see gutters and downpipes that aren't actually attached. Checking that the falls are correct, so the water is actually draining to a downpipe and not just pooling in a gutter. You're looking for cracking or rust, deformation, organic material, you know, leaves in gutters. If they sit there too long, you're going to not only cause blockages for water getting to the downpipes and away from the building, but the organic matter itself may eat away at the gutters and cause rust and rusting and degradation. Stormwater, check for effective drainage away from the building and clear drains. You know, often where the downpipe comes down to the ground, there might be a gully that's blocked and the water is just pooling at the bottom close to the building. You're going to eventually then get problems of deterioration around the perimeter of the building. Looking at chimneys, making sure that the brickwork is sound and that the mortar pointing is in good condition. Sometimes because they're in vulnerable locations, they do get covered in greenery and moss that will eventually degrade the mortar or the bricks themselves, and over time that could cause a problem. In wall claddings, in masonry, you want to check the mortar and look for any cracks. You can get spalling of the brickwork, or effervescence is where you get that white salt deposit, and on the brickwork or stonework it can occur as well. For timber, check for soundness, signs of decay or rot, loose boards which may be permitting water ingress, and checking for grime and organic material growth. Again, it can start to eat away at the timber and eventually cause rot and problems. As a heritage rule, when you are repairing, if you've got a rotten weatherboard, it's better from a heritage perspective to simply try and cut off the rotten end and splice in a new part rather than to replace the whole boards, because that way you're able to keep more of the original material. Ceilings and interior spaces, underfloor spaces. It's good to continue to keep an eye on that for any water ingress and ensure structural integrity. So just having a kind of routine look, it's often, it's often human nature just to wait for these things to become a problem instead of having a kind of upfront plan about just trying to regularly check on these things and make sure that everything's in good order. Cleaning and retaining the patina. One should ensure that only necessary cleaning is carried out, because over-cleaning can accelerate deterioration and wear of older building fabric. And so, of course, it's good to keep a building clean, and you want to remove any kind of mosses or lichens or things growing in on the building, because that will eventually deteriorate them. But most materials do have a weathering coat, and so it is important not to over clean them, because that can cause issues in itself. So you want to try and clean a building using the gentlest means and products possible to protect the existing finish or substrate, not damage the weathering coat, and ensure that the patina of the place is maintained. If it's if it's a heritage place and it has, you want to kind of, the patina and kind of expressing a little bit of its age is a good thing, as long as it's not to the extent that it's causing damage. So it is important to find that balance. If you're using soap or detergent or any chemical cleaning agents, do little sample tests in an area of the structure that's where it's not very visible. So just do a little sample. Make sure that what you're using is not going to cause any damage to the material itself. Here's an example for where you want to avoid abrasive cleaning methods such as high pressure water washing or sandblasting. Here's an instance you can see where the roughness of the brick caused by sandblasting has taken off the weathering coat of the bricks, and now makes the bricks really porous and open to absorbing water, and you can also see the way the sandblasting starts to take out a lot of the mortar, of course, which becomes a problem too. Again, another vulnerability for water to get in and cause further deterioration. And keep a record. Once you've found something that's effective and does the job, just try and think, I should make a note of that for next time. Here's an example. I put this in just because I think it shows, this is the barn at Abbeville near the airport, but the top one is before. And I think we'd all agree that it probably needed some conservation work done to it. It was in quite a deteriorated state. But at the same time, it's got, the character of an old barn that's used and has been there for a long time. When it was restored, albeit a lot of work had to happen to it to replace degraded timber, weatherboarding, and so on. But for me, it looks almost over-restored. It doesn't have the character of an old barn anymore because it just looks almost brand new. So it's finding that balance between trying to maintain the character of an old building and the patina and making sure the building is healthy without going too far in the direction of the renewal of new materials and ending up with something that defies its age. Vegetation is an important consideration. You've got to think about, you've got to think about keeping the vegetation away from the heritage building fabric so that you're getting some good air circulation around the base of a building and not blocking air vents, especially with timber-clad buildings. It's often a temptation. It's lovely to have some planting around the perimeter of a house, but if you can try and maintain a bit of a distance between the wall and the planting, it does enable some air to get into that area. It's very important that where you've got underfloor ventilation is really important to maintain. And so the ability for air to move under a floor, between the ground and the floor, to dry out areas is really important. Otherwise you can get situations like dry rot, which is a bit of a misnomer because it's actually caused by dampness without any air circulation, which will cause a fungal rot of timber, and then you get this powdery brown deterioration of timber. So bear that in mind. It really is important to try and keep a little bit of space between a wall and any plantings to maintain that free flow of air around there. You want to prevent organic material from collecting in gutters on roofs and in valleys as well. So just be very vigilant this time of year with leaves coming off trees and ending up on roofs and gutters. If that material just continues to sit there for a very long time, you are potentially facing blockages or deterioration of the material itself. So keep an eye on those things. So moving from maintenance to repairs, the repairs are made for the purpose of keeping a building in good condition and should not alter the essential nature of a historic place. You keep a place in good repair. In keeping a place in as good repair as possible is important for the structural integrity and resistance to weathering, but it also gives it a better chance of withstanding storms, high winds, seismic events. Those are really important to ensure that a place can stand up to those sorts of events. And the heritage principle, as reflected in the charter, is to do as much as is necessary, but as little as possible. So again, if you're needing to, if you've got a couple of rotten weatherboards, can you cut off the rotten end of it, splice in new timber, and not necessarily start to, think that you've got to replace the whole wall. There's intrinsic value in the original heritage fabric and the material nature of heritage places. Repairs should be made with like-for-like materials, as faithful as possible to the original materials used, and with respect to and having respect for the existing building fabric. So, and this is, and this will, if you're doing that, if you're doing repairs that do use like for like, you're probably avoiding a resource consent. It's only when you start to change and make material changes or design changes that you then need to go for a consent. In some instances, repair to a technically higher standard than original workmanship or materials can be justified. This is in the case where the life expectancy of the place or materiality is increased, where the new material is compatible with the old and where heritage values are not diminished. So it might have been that, you've got an original detail, but it's habitually causing problems to the building because it was never really a very good detail to begin with, or it, and also the technology has changed over time too, and sometimes, we have to accept that using a new material will just give you a longer life for the building, and I think as heritage people, we can sometimes be open to that because our interest in the end is the longevity and survival of a heritage building. And so there are times when it may be possible to consider something that isn't just like for like. So but in general terms, you basically want to, in a repair, to put back what you've found. Respect materials as they've been used historically. So don't paint previously unpainted surfaces, whether it be timber, plaster, brick. This work is often irreversible. We've had, places where brickwork has been painted, and, how difficult. It is very difficult then to remove paint from a surface of bricks that was never intended to be painted. So you're looking at reversibility. We're always looking at reversibility for things that happen to places, but try to avoid giving a treatment to a surface that hasn't been painted or hasn't been plastered and so on. Timber floors, repeated sanding will eventually reduce the thickness of the floor to the extent that some of the tongue and groove fixings may be affected and hidden nailing appear. So the timber floors they will not endlessly survive sanding over and over again. Traditionally, finishes for timber floors were often wax or oil, and that would have been the traditional appearance, and it's always noticeable and feels right, in my view, when you see a timber floor that is a wax or oil finish rather than a polyurethane finish. Polyurethane does probably give a harder wearing surface, but it also means that it probably needs to be sanded away when you put on a new coat, and that eventually affects the integrity of the floor itself. These floors are in Marivery House on Ranfurly Road. It's for sale at the moment. And but they have a lovely traditional finish. Windows. Traditional sash windows should be retained and their sash cords and weights repaired if necessary. There's the temptation, if you've got a sash window and it doesn't quite operate properly, you say, I have to get rid of that and put in a new window. but not necessarily. Those sash windows were traditionally very well made, and sometimes it could be that a sash cord or a weight or something has fallen, or it needs some adjustment, or there might be some rotten timber that needs to be replaced, so they might have to be rebuilt by a sensitive craftsman, carpenter. But that can be done. Steel windows, similarly, they can be refurbished, even if some of the metal is corroded. In the case of the Debrett's Hotel in central Auckland, all of these Crittall steel frame windows were taken out, sent back to Crittall's, they refurbished them, and they came back. Some other buildings have had their Crittall windows repaired in place, and it is not something that you have to think we need to replace these, but something that you think, well, maybe they can be refurbished. And be careful in making modifications for double glazing. I know there are a few firms that actually do some fairly good work around double glazing timber windows, sash windows, and it sometimes involves taking a bit out of the frame on the inside to get another layer. But sometimes we also have to be just a little bit careful too, because sometimes the windows may not, have experience of a villa in Freeman's Bay, which is very, very early, and it's still got the original glass in it. And it just didn't seem like the right thing to be doing. So you have to take each situation on a case-by-case basis, but there is the ability technology and ability now to double glaze existing timber windows, but you just have to be careful to look at what the intervention might involve in terms of the modifications to the original. And aluminium frames don't look the same. They're a different profile. In the same project for the Debrett's Hotel, their original idea was to take out all the steel frame windows and put in aluminium. And we looked at a few profiles. They were different. They were thicker. They didn't look the same. And in the end, refurbishing what they had gave a very good result and didn't require changing the look of the building to get a higher degree of both thermal and sound upgrade. As a boutique hotel, they're very sensitive both to the rooms being warm and of being soundproof as much as possible. Chimneys. Chimneys are an important feature of historic buildings, and attention to their survival is important to their heritage values. Many of these places, many of our older building stock had chimneys, and if you just simply say, I'm going to remove the chimney, the building doesn't look right, it looks naked. So we need to find ways to make sure that we try and retain chimneys as much as possible, because they are important features of our heritage homes, and it does contribute to the values and the aesthetic and architectural look of a place. We need to check the condition of bricks. Sometimes chimneys are plastered, so we need to check on that, and check for stability and soundness. With increasing need to be sensitive to any seismic vulnerabilities. A lot of chimneys are being strengthened or braced, and it's prudent to think about those things. Paints. One can take paint scrapes of buildings and try and find their original colors that might be informing you what you would paint an existing heritage place. There are also Racine, for example, does a heritage color chart where they, based on paint scrapes, based on knowledge of what early houses were, colors that they were painted. There's a palette that's been developed. They also have a little chart which goes through different styles of buildings and different periods of buildings to give you an indication of what were prevalent colors at those times. That's really helpful information if you're thinking about painting. You've also got to be very careful about paints too, because you've got to try and ensure that the paint has a degree of breathability. Obviously you want the paint is protecting the timber, and so it's got to have a protective quality, but at the same time, if it's allowing a little bit of moisture breathing, it can adapt to the outside conditions accordingly. Some plasticized paints, you really have to avoid them, because what they do is they trap moisture behind, causing bubbling and blistering on the surface and deterioration of the surface that it's intended to protect. So you can see in these examples, it's just water getting in behind there and causing the paint to bubble up. And of course, with the water trapped in behind there, you can imagine what it's doing to the timber itself. Well, you'll usually get. Well, you'd need to talk. You'd need to talk to the people you're buying the paint from, and. Well, it's. There are plasticized paints that exist, and they exist, you know, you would use them in some situation, maybe like pools, swimming pools and things like that. But, and it's kind of interesting because a lot of people will choose them thinking that they're going to be protecting their place. They'll buy them thinking, oh, this is impermeable, they'll be good, I won't allow, you know, no water will get in. But the reality is that all materials should have a degree of breathability so that they can adapt to the humidity outside and they can dry out, and you know they breathe, you know, and so you know it is just a word of caution. I mean, most normal paints you buy are not this degree of you know, kind of impermeability, but it is worth noting. Lead paint too. A lot of older places will have, if they've got very original paint, will have lead in them, and you do have to be really careful about that when you're stripping off old paint. So you need to be aware. Use a protective mask if you're doing it yourself, and gloves when removing the paint, and or get specialist help, you know, to remove it. I do know people who have, you know, zealously taken on an old villa and done all the paint stripping themselves and ended up very ill as a result of getting lead poisoning. Mortars. Traditional mortars were generally lime-based compared with modern ones which are cement-based. And in principle, with a mortar should be softer than the masonry that it's binding, because that way it means that if a wall, for example, like here, you can see the salt deposits, and what's happening is that the salt, instead of coming out through the mortar, if it were softer, it would come out through the mortar. But because it can't and the bricks are softer, it's coming out through the bricks. And eventually those salts can, they're not only unsightly, but they can cause deterioration of the brick itself. You can get spalling and that sort of thing. So generally, it's with older buildings, they will generally, if it's brick or stone, will have a lime-based mortar. And they also have a degree of ductability as well, so that because they're a bit softer, they also allow, they do their job, but they also allow just a little bit of movement as well. So when you get cement mortars that aren't allowed to move, you sometimes end up with this sort of situation where the cracking will happen right through the bricks themselves rather than occur on the mortar joint. Metals. Be aware of the galvanic series of noble to base metals, because some metals cannot be directly combined without causing corrosion or deterioration. So, you can see the damage that putting dissimilar metals together can cause when there's a reaction against different metals. So the most noble metals, are gold, platinum, silver, stainless steel, titanium, copper, blah, blah, blah. And some of the most susceptible to corrosion are zinc, aluminum, mild steel, cast iron, and so on in the other direction. And I have a personal experience where we have a conservatory with a copper gutter, and it had a tiny little copper downpipe that when we were doing some work to our house, we put the gutter into a larger downpipe connected with a higher roof that was zinc-alume. And within the year, we ended up with a downpipe that was just zinc-alume lace. Basically, coming from the copper being the more noble material into a less noble material, it caused deterioration. So those things are worth keeping in the back of your mind and just checking out, when you're doing those sorts of things, because it's very easy to do, but can cause a fair bit of damage if you've got incompatibles together. Also, it's really important to get skilled tradespeople and appropriate specialists. It is, as we've discussed, sometimes hard to find really skilled people. They're getting fewer and fewer, unfortunately. What is nice to see, though, is that there are some younger craftsmen coming into the fields of stonemasonry and plasterwork and carpentry. And as Richard said, it's sometimes difficult for the council or Heritage New Zealand to recommend people, but we can sometimes give you a steer on a number of people that we've worked with. It gives you a little bit of a guide as to maybe some people that you might try if you're looking in a situation to try and get appropriate people involved. And it does make all the difference to have skilled people. This fellow came out of plaster retirement to do the work in Hume Court. And he just had the skills and the knowledge to be able to do the plaster work repairs, and it was quite extensive, rather than to say, oh, we'll just take out all this drummy plaster and put in gibboard, So it is finding the people with those appropriate skills and knowledge, can make a huge difference to being able to maintain those traditional materials and surfaces and repair things that need attention and access. There are health and safety issues, and increasingly, we're kind of being made aware of the kind of health and safety risks around us in our environment. But it is important to make sure, some of the places like interior valleys on a roof or underneath the house and so on, they are often very hard places to access. So it's worth thinking about, how is it that I'm going to make it easier to be able to do these regular inspections? So, take some time and just think, how can we implement safely gaining access to places that require ongoing vigilance, so that the task doesn't become too onerous or dangerous and we just think, oh, I can't get up there, I won't bother, I'll leave it till next year. So find ways to make it a little bit easier. And if necessary, get experienced helpers to help carry out this work. And then you have the peace of mind that something is still in good order and won't need attention. And knowledge about a place, its significance, the building fabric, features, construction, the setting that contributes to it, will aid in making informed choices about the care and treatments necessary to ensure the continuation of those values, so that places don't experience over-restoration. You know, we've talked about kind of going too far, where you actually make the place vulnerable by over-cleaning or over-treating. The loss of authenticity. You know, if you have to replace all the weatherboards on one side of your house rather than keeping a good vigilant look, you know, at those weatherboards and detecting whether there are little areas you need to repair on an incremental basis, will mean that you've still got those original weatherboards. And often the quality of timber you're going to get if you have to replace them is not going to be as high as some of the, you know, beautiful kauri timber that was used to construct them. Also, if you're continuing to maintain and repair a place, you're avoiding inappropriate repair techniques and materials. So the knowledge that you have and an attention to the detail and making sure that you're making informed choices about repair work is going to maintain the integrity of your place. It maintains the physical integrity of a place, avoiding major interventions, loss, and cost. You know, going back to William Morris and his tenets. I just thought I'd mention too, strictly speaking, not considered repairs and maintenance, where changes have been made in the past that are unsympathetic. Consider reconstructing lost materials or features when you're doing work to a place. We've heard in Carolyn's presentation about all the different styles and having knowledge of what might be appropriate in order to reinstate features that someone has come along before you and mucked around with. It gives you a chance to kind of recoup that value. If a place is in a special character area, you might consider what was there previously, ideally, or you can look at period examples as clues as to what might be appropriate. You know, if you've lost a bay window, you think, well, what kind of bay would it be? Well, this is a California bungalow, so it would, you know, what would be appropriate is this sort of bay. So looking for clues of what might be appropriate. But if a place is historic heritage, scheduled by Auckland Council or listed with Heritage New Zealand, there must be good evidence of what used to be there, either through photos, through original drawings, or detailed specification and accounts, for example, to support what would be expected to be a faithful reconstruction. There's a kind of stricter regime around places that are scheduled or listed. And remember that maintenance and repair are the most important conservation methods in the ongoing care and survival of heritage places. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.
You're welcome.